on a journey. And we're all on a journey, all of us. Okay. All right. So let's move along here. Let's talk about the word apologetic. What is that? That's a fancy word, but some of you are familiar with it. Maybe some of you are not. It comes from a Greek word, apologia. And apologia does not mean apologizing. Unfortunately, the English word we have comes from the same Greek word, but it means something completely different in Greek. What it means is to defend a position, to defend an idea or a concept, okay? It includes two things. It includes arguing for one's position on an issue and defending attacks against it, okay? A good apologist can do both. What do we mean by the word argue? It means to bring forward reasons concerning a matter in discussion or debate, okay? It is not apologizing for our position. So we're using the word argue here in an apologetic sense. But keep in mind, the objective is not to win an argument, but it's to present your case for truth in a loving way with genuine care for the other individual. We need to present our arguments without being argumentative. And we need to present our defense without being defensive. Okay? I'm going to repeat that. We need to present our arguments without being argumentative, and we need to present our defense without being defensive. And we need to genuinely seek to find out what the other person's perspective is, which means listening. We have to listen. We have to take the time and not be in a hurry to tell them what we think, but actually listen to what they think. It'll help them to open up and to relax with us, right? Emotions. What about emotions? Well, you know, they have their place, but they cannot be the basis for a discussion. Why is that? Well, because they can get carried away, right? We don't want to be in denial here. The topic of abortion is a very emotional subject for most people. And this is all the more reason why we need to engage the subject while avoiding emotional arguments as much as possible, okay? So let's talk about some tools that will help us to do that. Let's talk a little bit about logic and reason. Ken Samples, who is one of the scholars at Reasons to Believe, said this in his book, A World of Difference, on page 41. And if you're interested in that book, I think we have some copies at the back, along with a whole bunch of other books that you can look at. All of our books are $15, by the way, and that is way below cost. We offer it through the chapter, basically almost giving them away. So you're welcome to have a look afterwards. And the guy to talk to is Jan. Jan, wave your hand. There he is. Okay. So the laws of logic help us to remain grounded in what's true and not distracted by emotional appeals or other subjective arguments, okay? And I want to introduce you to just 3 laws of logic. The first one is the law of non-contradiction. Stated simply, the law of non-contradiction means that A, whatever A is, cannot equal non-A. Okay, that sounds really simple, doesn't it? Put simply, something cannot both be true and false at the same time. It's either true or it's false. Now, this law becomes paramount whenever we're discussing opinions about the definition of life and death. Many people have opinions. The question is, what is true? And it also helps us to expose contradictions. The second law is the law of the excluded middle, which means that A is either A or it's non-A. It can't be something in between. It cannot be a blend of A and non-A. Now, this is similar to the first law, but it specifically states that something has to be either one thing or another thing, okay? And the third law is the law of identity. A thing, whether it's a person or a place, event, whatever it is, this law states that a thing is identical to itself and different from all other things. These 3 laws taken together will assist us when it comes to our discussion on the preborn. So you need to be familiar with these 3. They will help you. All right, I want to talk a little bit about pro-life and pro-choice reasoning. As I said before, it is both an intellectual and an emotional topic. If you pretend that it isn't, you'll get into trouble. But here's basically how the reasoning goes. The pro-choice perspective is this: it's not human, or it's only human at some point. The pro-life perspective is it is human, we're talking about the preborn here, and it is human at conception. There are two other deeper levels to this discussion. The first one is the concept of what we call human exceptionality. For those of you that have ever studied any theology, you may be familiar with the term the imago Dei. That means the image of God, right? And this is a theological concept that basically tells us that we as human beings bear the image of God. We are created in his image according to Genesis. The second issue that comes up in this discussion is what we call equivocation between humanity and other life forms. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So human exceptionality basically goes like this. Humans are unique creations of God, made in God's image, as I said. Humans have innate, intrinsic value. It is not something that is bestowed on us by others or by the state. It is something that is intrinsic to us and bestowed on us by God. Okay? The argument goes that humans are just animals at a higher level of evolution. And of course, this is what the Imago Dei refutes. It leads to this concept of equivocation. And one of the words that you'll often hear in conversation is the word fetus, which is used for both humans and animals. And a very unfortunate thing occurs whenever that happens, is that it tends to imply that humans are just like all other animals and therefore not exceptional. Now, if you throw Darwinism into this, or any kind of evolutionary paradigm, it reinforces this concept so that people, your average person out there, believes that humans are just animals like other animals, that we have evolved like other animals, and therefore we are not exceptional in any way. We just happen to have bigger brains and are a little higher on the evolutionary chain. But again, the image of God says that is not true. Humans are unique and special because God says so. Okay, so let's get to the big question. The fundamental question when it comes to abortion is this: is a preborn a human being? We have to use logic and reason, compassion, grace, and love to address this question whenever we have conversations with those who differ with us regarding the evidence. Remember the laws of logic. This is not about people's opinions. It's about what we can prove using logic and reason. So here's the basic argument. It goes like this: abortion is the intentional termination of a preborn life. A preborn is a human being. Therefore, abortion is the intentional termination of a human being's life. And therefore, abortion should be wrong. This is simple, it's to the point, it's logical. The question is it a human life? Well, that's what we're discussing tonight. Before we do that, it's really critical that we define our terminology. So I just want to stop here and look at some of the words that you see on the screen. Yes, you can see them. And work through the definitions. And it's important to do that when you're having a conversation with someone. We're saying abortion is the intentional termination of a preborn human being's life. By intentional, what do we mean? We mean it's premeditated, as opposed to accidental or non-premeditated, like manslaughter. Okay, it is intentional. By termination, we mean it causes death. By preborn, we mean alive, but not yet born. And by human being, well, we're going to get to that just now. So let's ask the question, is abortion intentional? Yes, it is. There's intention on the part of both the mother and the abortionist. Is the preborn alive? Yes, as we will see in a lot more detail just now. Does it cause death? Yes, there was a living being, and abortion terminates that life. You might say, yes, 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 but is it human? And that question is the crux of the matter. So let's go back to the big question and revisit it. Is a preborn human? If a preborn is human, then abortion is the intentional killing of a human being. So guess what we're going to do? We're going to look at the nature of the preborn in a lot more detail to try and add some color and some definitions and some truth to these questions. So we're going to do that by looking at the nature of the preborn. We're going to examine some arguments. I'm going to put up arguments that have been brought forward, many of which you've heard, some of which maybe you haven't. And there may be some that you're aware of that I have not included here. Right? This is not an exhaustive list. It's meant to give you some sort of introduction to the topic. And maybe during our Q&A, you might have another argument that you've heard against why, a preborn is not human or whatever, something related to that. Feel free during our Q&A to bring that up. One of the statements that we kept hearing over and over during the COVID-19 pandemic, was that we follow the science. How many people have heard that? Ad nauseum, right? We follow the science. Well, so that's what we're going to do tonight. I'm going to follow the science when it comes to answering these questions. And in terms of what we know about the preborn. Each slide is going to have an argument, and then we're going to discuss it. Now, some of you may have noticed, and this is a little bit of an aside, but I wanted to just touch on it. You've noticed that I might use interchangeably pro-choice and pro-abortion, okay? And that's a little bit intentional on my part. And I want to explain why. If we go back to our definition of terms and we ask someone what they mean by pro-choice, you're essentially drawing the line between being pro-abortion and pro-life. Why? Well, the reason is because the argument that you're pro-choice implies that there is a choice. Is that right? If you say you're pro-choice, you mean that there's some choice about something. The choice to not kill a preborn is not a choice that society is debating. I'm going to repeat that. The choice to not kill a preborn is not a choice that our society is debating. In other words, society does not question women who have babies. It's called motherhood. Even if they give them up for adoption. Is that right? There is no debate about that. No mother has ever been criticized for having a baby. Well, I suppose some have, but therefore there's no choice here to be discussed except the choice to kill the preborn. That is why the term pro-choice is a classic red herring. Many would counter this, of course, and they'd say, well, when I say pro-choice, I mean that the choice to abort should be the mother's alone, and that by challenging that, you're challenging the mother's rights to that choice. Okay, fair enough. At least now you're defining your terms. Most people don't understand that. They just use the term. And so you can just ask and say, well, what do you mean by that? And we're going to get back to this issue of the mother's choice in a moment. Just for the record, I want to state that I am pro-choice. I believe that every pregnant woman should have the choice to deliver her preborn child safely and either keep him or give them up to a loving adoptive home. They should have that choice. Okay. Having said all this, I want to just reinforce that it is very dangerous to use the word pro-abortion, or certainly to call someone pro-abortion. It's just too emotional. So we're talking around the subject here, but I want to give you some guidance on how to use terminology. It's one thing to identify that a person is using a red herring. It's another thing to tell them that they're using a red herring and get them upset. You don't want to do that. Okay? All right. So if someone says they're pro-choice, just respect that, work with it. All right. First argument, it is only potential human life. But a potential human being must be an actual something else. Here's our laws of logic. Remember? The excluded middle. If it's a potential human being, then it must be something else at the moment. It hasn't become a human being yet, so what is it? In other words, stating this begs the question, well, what is it? Is it a frog, a fish, a monkey, a duck? What is it? It clearly belongs to no other species than the human species. And of course, we could ask the question, when does it change from potential to actual? When does that happen? The so-called trimesters that we hear about during pregnancy, first trimester, second, third trimester, are used in many discussions to define when certain abortions are okay and others are not. Everybody aware of that? I'm sure you have, first trimester abortions, second trimester abortions, etc. Earlier is okay with a lot of people. Later is typically not so okay, based on a number of factors that we're going to examine tonight. The logic of the trimester system escapes most people, other than a convenient way to divide up 9 months into 3 equal periods. It is biologically absurd. It makes no sense. Nothing magical happens between the end of the first trimester and the beginning of the second trimester. All that happens is the sun goes down and the moon comes up. And then the sun comes up in the morning. That's it. That's all that happens. Nothing else happens except a little tiny bit of growth in that preborn. It does not change dramatically from the day before. The development process does not occur in 3-by-3 monthly processes. It is a continuous process without pause. This is vital. It is a continuous process from day one to birth. The time of this change into humanness is never well defined by pro-choice or pro-abortion groups. In fact, the strategy of abortion providers is to deliberately dehumanize the growing entity inside the womb. You've heard the terms: products of conception, contents of the womb, embryonic tissue, calling abortion a medical procedure, referring to it as healthcare for women. That's my favorite. This is part of the equivocation issue that we talked about earlier. And if someone can get their foot in the door on this and equivocate on these terms, then they gain a lot of traction. And this, by the way, this is just common today. This is not even challenged. People use these terms and no one even blinks. But it's absurd. It makes no sense in terms of the developmental process of a preborn. Here's another argument. It's only a mass of tissue and blood. This is a picture of a 3-week-old embryo. Most people, most women do not know that they're pregnant at this point in time, unless you use one of the pregnancy tests. However, the heart starts to beat 2 to 4 weeks after conception. The brain is already generating brain waves after 7 weeks. Sorry, I just want to go back. I'm going to show you another slide in a minute, but the key message here is the complexity of a growing embryo. Even from the first moments of fertilization, it is absolutely stunning. The science of embryology, which is why do certain cells turn into specific tissue types or cell types, like bone, like skin, like muscle, like brain? How does that happen from the fertilization of an egg by a sperm? How does that happen? I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but this is a field that we still don't know very much about. It's driven by a bunch of genes that create a whole range of molecules we call cytokines, and cytokines are responsible for turning off and turning on other genes. I worked in this field for the last 4 years, and it is absolutely mind-boggling how complex it is. By the second month, okay, when most abortions take place, the arms, the legs, the fingers, the toes, the ears, the nose, the mouth, the muscles, the organs, and the bones are either formed or almost finished being formed. This is a picture of a 2-month-old preborn. And at this stage, and this is a very important fact, the preborn has everything that an adult human being has, albeit at a less developed stage. The lungs, the kidneys, the liver, all function. Someone once said that if women's abdomens were transparent, one wonders if abortions would be so frequent, because you don't get to see. Incidentally, how frequent are they? 50 million in the US since 1973, and over 4 million in Canada since 1969. So this entity, albeit tiny, is not a nondescript mass. This is a 6-month-old preborn when abortions are still perfectly legal. Here's another argument. It isn't fully developed. Well, a 4-year-old isn't fully developed either. In fact, a human is not fully developed until the late teens and early 20s. I don't know about you. Oh, yeah. Can you do that, Bruno? It's up at the top of the screen and somebody's asking to come in. Can you do that?
I can do that. Oh,
He must have dropped out. No problem. Okay. So late teens, early 20s, adults are, pretty much fully developed. But even after that, we continue to mature in different ways. Can the stage of development really define what a being is, any being, human or otherwise? Is an adult more human than a child, or just more developed? Are those already born more human than the preborn, or merely more developed? Is there a magic moment in which a non-human can become human? Of course not. This is a fallacy which confuses the stage of development with the nature of the developing being. So using this logic that it isn't fully developed, therefore it's not human, would allow us to call anyone who is less developed than an adult a non-human, if you follow the logic. 4-year-old isn't human, a 6-year-old is not human because they're not fully developed. And that would allow us to take their life at whim. Pretty scary scenario. Now you're probably thinking, yeah, but the issue, Don, is some other things. Okay, we're going to get to that. It's inside the womb. So we're now bringing up the concept of location. The location of an individual determines whether or not it's a human being. That's the question. So a preborn, the moment before birth, is not human, but immediately after birth becomes human. How? Why? What's the logic here? Is there any logic? Now I'm going to tell you something that will scare you. If you read section 223 of the Criminal Code of Canada, it actually defines what a human being is and helps to explain a lot. I quote, a human being is, quote, a child that has completely proceeded from the body of its mother, unquote. I'll bet you didn't know that was in the Criminal Code of Canada. Does that definition make any sense at all? So according to the Criminal Code, yes, before birth it's not human, and after birth it is human. Did you notice the use of the word child? A child that has completely proceeded. Oh, wait a minute. When did it become a child? Was it a child before it was born? Evidently not, because it wasn't human. So following this logic, when a child's halfway out, is it only half human? Okay. Now, this is really going to shock you, but this is a fact. I watched it myself live on TV. According to the state of New York, the answer is to this question is no, it is not half human. It is still not human, which is why they recently passed a law permitting partial birth abortions. It's unspeakable how this is done, and I'm not going to tell you. But basically, it involves killing the child just before it emerges from the womb. When this law was passed in the state legislature of New York State, the entire gallery erupted in applause. In Canada, we have no law covering any specific stage in development right up to birth. We have no law in Canada. Zero, nada, none. No first trimester, second trimester, third trimester is okay. Nothing. Anytime is okay. So according to the law in both Canada and the US, whatever that is on the left is not human, but that on the right is human. Okay, let's keep going. It might be imperfect. Might be something wrong with the preborn. The short answer to that would be, you mean like you and me? Imperfection is a classic example of what we call a slippery slope. If perfection or some set of requirements are required for us to have value, then we are all in trouble. This is why abortion and euthanasia are two sides of the same coin. I'm not talking about euthanasia tonight, but you can see how they're related. It all comes down to the question, what is it? And for the elderly amongst us, who are we, or what are we? You may recall, those of you that have studied anything about the history of the Second World War, that Nazi eugenics was based on the concept of what? Perfection. A perfect race. I think I've said enough on that point. Here's another argument. It doesn't look human. Even if I could look in the womb and see it, it doesn't look human. So then, should we conclude that one's appearance determines humanness. Is a chimp more human than an embryo because it looks more human? I don't know about you, but that guy looks a lot more human than that guy. Yeah? Which one looks more human to you? The important question here is, what is it? Not what does it look like? This is why this question of what is it is so important. It gets to the question of the nature of the being, not the parameters of the being, like what it looks like, what it smells like, how big it is, how small it is, where it is. None of those things. The question is, what is its inherent nature? Chimps and humans don't have the same nature. And DNA tells us which one is which. By the way, the picture that I used here, I deliberately chose because it doesn't necessarily, it may not necessarily be a human embryo, for all you know. A fish embryo and a dog embryo and a cat embryo look very similar at this stage. And that's why appearance cannot be the definition of humanness. It's the nature of the growing entity that matters. Here's another argument. It's dependent on the mother. Well, a 3-month-old baby is totally dependent on another human being too. It's not able to survive alone outside the womb either. It needs comfort, care, protection, food, or it will die. I don't know if you've noticed that. Those of you that had babies, you actually had to do something to keep them alive. One of my favorite jokes when I meet a friend whose kids have grown up, I always say, what have you been feeding them? You know, you need to stop feeding them and they'll slow down, you know. It's a joke. But yeah, if you feed a child, what does it do? Okay. And I'm going to say this again later on, but if you leave a preborn alone, what does it do? The complete dependence of a newborn or an infant or a toddler on others makes it no less human. Why does it matter then for the preborn? Because of where it is? Well, in that case, then you're talking about a location question, which we've already seen is irrelevant to what the preborn is. The total independence of anyone is actually a myth. We're all dependent on someone or something other than ourselves. We all need stuff to live, right? I hope that everybody agrees with that, right? How could anyone conceive of a life that doesn't require some level of dependency? Now you'll hear people say, I'm not dependent on anyone. Okay, maybe you're not dependent on anyone, but actually you are, because someone had to make the food that you eat. Someone had to drive the truck that delivered the food. Someone had to, the list goes on. So we're all dependent on others to one degree or another. Okay, here's one of my favorites. It's not viable. What do we mean by that? We mean the ability to survive outside the womb. If you were to suddenly change the location of the preborn from inside to outside, can it survive is what we call viability. And if viability is a determining factor of humanness, then we have a problem. And we're going to explore that now a little bit more. This is a picture from Life magazine, and it shows a 7-week-old baby born at 25 weeks of gestation. So it's a premature baby. The youngest preborn ever saved was in 2014 at 21 weeks, weighing less than 1 pound. However, since I wrote that, I met a neonatal nurse that I happen to know at McMaster Children's Hospital, and she said that they have that down to 20 weeks now. Viability is affected by 2 things, time and place. And we're going to just talk a little bit about this. Time, because as technology gets more sophisticated, we save these premature babies at earlier and earlier degrees of prematurity. If you compare the survival rates today compared to 100 years ago, there's a big difference, right? Place, because the odds of a premature newborn surviving outside the womb, that is its viability, rises, dramatically the closer you are to a specialized medical center. If you don't live near a medical center, your chance is less of surviving. That baby's chance is less. And we're going to look at a few examples of what I mean to illustrate this. A 7-month preborn, fortunate enough to be born in the 21st century, has a decent chance of survival. Therefore, is it more human than one that is born in the 19th century, which would not have survived outside the womb? So is time got anything to do with humanness? So if it does, then wherever in history you were conceived will define whether you're human or not, following the logic. Not only that, but a 6-month preborn fortunate enough to be near a medical center is viable, therefore human. Whereas a 6-month preborn in a rural town on that same day is not viable because it would not survive outside the womb and therefore is not human. The viability argument is similar to the dependency argument, which we've already shown has nothing to do with humanness. Okay, another favorite. It's part of the woman's body. I'm going to take a short break here. All right, let's assume that we agree. It's part of the woman's body. Which part? The hands? Are those the mother's hands? The heart? The brain? Logically, if that's true, if a preborn is part of a woman's body, then a pregnant woman has 4 hands, 4 feet, 2 brains. And if the preborn is a boy, the woman has both male and female genitalia. This is an absurd conclusion, of course, but it's based on the premise. The mother is incapable of moving or controlling anything in the baby. She cannot voluntarily move its arms or legs or mouth or eyes unless she pushes from the outside. She cannot control it with her mind. She has no control over any of the systems of a preborn child. Why? Because it's a unique, separate, however dependent being. Now, this is a very common and emotion-laden argument. Very effective in the Western world with its obsessive focus on personal rights. You've all seen the placard, "My body, my choice." Well, just logically, it can't be your body because 50% of the time, it's not even the same gender as you. In other words, 50% of the time, women give birth to boys, right? So if we can show from an apologetic perspective that the preborn is not the woman's body, then one can immediately conclude neither is it her choice. Just based on the premise of it's my body. Well, if it's not your body, then no, you don't have that choice. You can't make that argument. You might make an other argument about inconvenience and about whatever argument you want to make, but you can't make the argument as part of your body. I think this can also be effectively used, this approach, with women who claim that men can have no opinion on the matter because men are incapable of bearing children. Well, what's that got to do with it? Does the ability to bear children determines a person's ability to argue for the humanness of a preborn? Answer, no. This is a humanity question. Continuing on, this is a few things I want to highlight here that are very important. The first one is that a preborn has its own unique genetic code in each and every one of its cells. It's not the mother's code, and it's not the father's code. It's its own unique genome or genetic code. A preborn is in the mother, attached to the mother, but not part of the mother. It's a very important distinction. This genetic code that exists in every cell of a growing preborn controls every cell. The mother's DNA and the father's DNA are combined at conception, those of you that remember your grade 8 science, to create a totally unique new genome in each cell of the growing embryo. There's transfer of food and oxygen to the baby, sure. The mother is part of getting rid of the baby's waste, but the organism that is a preborn is run by its own unique DNA. Its development is coded by its own DNA, not the mother's and not the father's, by its own unique genome. Here's an interesting question. I've said it earlier, I'm going to say it again, and I'll say it again later. What happens if you just leave it alone? What do you get? You never get a part of a woman's body being born. You get a brand new human being every single time, 100% of the time, unless, of course, there are challenges during development. It's only a bunch of cells. It's just a bunch of cells. A few cells. Well, so are we. We're also just a bunch of cells. We happen to have trillions. A preborn has anywhere between 1 and 1 trillion cells, just like adults. And their cells, just like ours, all have purpose and they all have function. So this idea that it's just a bunch of cells is a kind of a throwaway term. And you need to push back when somebody says that, because we can technically use that argument for every person on the planet. At some point, someone will argue that this picture that I have up on the slide, which represents a very young, just after fertilized zygote, could not possibly be human, assuming that it came from a human father and human mother. But I would argue that it cannot logically be anything else. What else could it be? We go all the way back to our first argument. If it's not that, then what is it? It's easy to say, well, it's not human. Well, then what is it? And so we go into all the different arguments, right? The primary point of my presentation tonight is the nature of the preborn. What is it inherently? Is it human or not? So we're going to keep focusing on that. Someone said that a computer chip is not a computer. And it was an argument they were using to defend abortion, saying, look, it's not a computer yet, it's just a computer chip. And what I would say to that is, well, what would you say if you had a computer chip that all you had to do was keep it powered up? Just keep power to the chip, and the chip turns into a computer all by itself. Then what would you say? Would you still say it's just a chip? Or would you say it's a growing computer? You see my point? You can nod your heads then. I know you're awake. Okay, good. All right. It isn't alive. So that's an easy one for scientists, because there's a fairly strict definition of what alive means in the sciences, in the biological sciences. It's growing, it's developing, it's responding, it's functioning, it's burning food and oxygen, it's giving off waste products, and its cells are reproducing. Guess what? Those are the properties of all living organisms. If you're alive, your cells do that, your organs do that, all that stuff. It's a life. And then we come to the big numero uno argument, I think. Someone will say, okay, Don, I'll grant you it's alive, but is it a person? Is it a person? This is a common fallback position for people who say, yeah, okay, it's human. Sure. No problem. This one here. That one. Okay. Let's keep going. All right. So the person says, oh, okay, it's alive, but is it a person? So this is a common fallback position, like I said, and this is where definitions are really important. Someone says, is it a person? You say, all right, well, let's explore that. What's a person? So here's two definitions that I found. The first one is a human being regarded as an individual. The second one is a being with certain attributes such as reason, morality, consciousness. Now, the Oxford Dictionary is the first one, human being regarded as an individual. We've already demonstrated, I think, that the preborn is an individual separate from his or her mother. And we are trying to demonstrate that a preborn is a human being. Therefore, a preborn is a person. Okay, well, what if we use the second definition? This is according to Wikipedia. In this case, we would argue that if you have to have certain attributes such as reason, morality, and consciousness to be human and to be a person, then a 1-month-old baby isn't either a person. But we believe that 1-month-old babies will become persons, according to the second definition, if we just let them grow. And so it is with the preborn. Just leave it alone. What happens to it? It becomes a child and grows and becomes someone with all these attributes. We are arguing that according to definition 1, we tick the box. According to definition 2, it just needs time. And this is where someone might say, well, if they're not a person until a certain point, then we can get away with abortions up until that point. The problem is there's no way you can define when that entity growing in a mother becomes a person. There's just no way. It's a process with no, oh, that's it. They crossed the line from non-person to person. It's exactly the same argument as non-human to human. It is a continuum. Okay, let's keep going. We're almost there. If we can prove, as I think we have, that the preborn is a life, and since it has human chromosomes orchestrating that life, then it must be an actual human life. No matter what stage a preborn is at in its development, it is a human being. All right, let's make some conclusions. I have endeavored to answer the question, what is a preborn? And I hope that I have demonstrated reasonably unequivocally that a preborn is a human being. If a preborn, no matter its stage of development is an actual living human being, then abortion is the intentional killing of a human being. Here's some final thoughts, and then we're going to have a short break and we'll take some questions. When you present some of these arguments to people, don't expect them to just throw in the towel and go, oh, you know what? I'm so glad you told me that. I've been wrong my whole life. Thank you for telling me. That's not going to happen. Okay. They need time. Okay. Many people will need a lot of time to adjust. And for a lot of people, it's a chipping away at their thinking process before they're going to change. Unfortunately, some people, no matter what, will not change their views. They'll reject these things. We have to be human. We have to think about the fact that it's one human talking to another human. And like I said earlier, everybody's on a different journey. The second thing is that we don't want to condemn anyone for being pro-abortion or pro-choice or having had an abortion. This is so, so important. It's God's job to speak to people's hearts, not yours. Your job is to present the truth in a logical, reasonable way with grace and love. You should always approach a female person that you're talking to from the perspective that she may very well have had an abortion or more than one. Assume that, and it will help to guide your speech, and you won't say dumb things. Okay? I don't know if many of you saw the recent movie called Unplanned, all about the director of Planned Parenthood in the US who had 2 abortions, and she eventually completely changed her perspective, and she was won over by a bunch of people who basically were kind to her and showed her genuine friendship. They didn't stand and hurl abuse at her. They didn't tell her she was going to burn in hell. They didn't do any of those things. They just loved her, and it changed her heart. It took time, and it took prayer. So we have to think, how would Jesus approach this? And lastly, the best position that you can take on this issue is on your knees. We have to think prayer. It is a spiritual issue, best fought on our knees. We need to pray for courage in defending the ones that we're talking to, pray for our leaders, etc. What can you do? Well, I think it's important that if we're pro-life, we have to be pro-life 24/7. What do I mean by that? I mean we need to be consistent. We have to always be on our game. We should support organizations that are supportive of mothers who are struggling with decisions around this, who may or may not have had an abortion. TLC is the Life Center, which is in Newmarket, where I live, and I'm very honored to have the executive director of TLC here with us tonight, Jackie Mintz. Jackie's here. Coalition Life, Campaign for Life, other similar organizations. Get connected to them, see how you can help. Learn, study, and comfort and support someone who's having an unexpected pregnancy. And again, we need to pray. Just a couple of slides from the scriptures. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the powers of this dark world, from Ephesians 6. I think we need to strive for a country, I'm talking about Canada now, but everywhere in the world, that doesn't want abortions, whether they're legal or not. And we need to do that one person at a time. Some of us will be called to influence laws and influence vast numbers of people at one time, parliaments, governments, whatever. But every one of us is called to speak to people that we can when the opportunity presents itself. Just two more scriptures to finish up our time tonight. From Psalms 139, my frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place. Your eyes saw my unformed body. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Thanks, everyone. We're going to take a break. You might need a bio break. Now's the time to go. And we'll come back together in, say, 5-10 minutes. And then we'll take some questions. Okay, guys, I'm going to ask everybody to find their seat again so we can have a conversation. I want to give everybody an opportunity to ask questions and, provide us an answer. So, let's start with the room. We got a lot of people online as well tonight, so we'll look at those questions too. But does anyone have a question here in the room? We'll start with you.
Well, I think the main point is that human beings have a soul. And I think that's why, we're totally different than animals. Or special. And so my point is, when exactly do you think that the soul is attached to the evidence? When does the soul become part of the human being?
Right.
That's where,
So you're asking a theological question now, which is fine, no problem. And it gets back to early on in my talk, I talked about the Imago Dei. Just to define our terms, Christians typically use the soul when they mean the spiritual aspect of a human being, right? That part of us that is unique in terms of God's creation. And we say that we have a soul, and by that we mean an eternal soul, something that lives on after our bodies die, right? That's the classical understanding of the term that you're using. Other Christians will use the words our spirit, the spirit of a person. Because, and the reason I'm drawing a distinction is because you may recall that in RTB, we often talk about the soulish creatures.
Stand in front of your computer.
Okay,
so
sorry.
I think if the mic is there.
Okay. We talk about soulish creatures. Remember, we went through Genesis and we talked about the nephesh creatures that God created. And what was unique about them was that they had certain attributes that we call the soulish attributes because they're similar to the things that we have. What am I talking about? I'm talking about animals like dogs and cats and cows and donkeys and horses, animals that God created with which we can develop a relationship, a very real relationship. I don't know if you've noticed that, right? And then there's other animals that God created that we can't develop a relationship with. They just don't have those attributes. And so God drew a distinction and does draw a distinction in Genesis between the prior animals and the nephesh animals, which came later that he created. So in that sense, we humans have a soul, soulish attributes, the same as those animals have a soulish attribute. But we go one step further as humans and we say we also have a spiritual nature that animals do not have. And that's really the distinction that I think you're largely focusing on, right? And that's it's an important distinction. And so the answer to your question is we don't know, but we have to assume that it's at the moment of conception, because that's when everything comes together and you are a human. Everything I've said tonight would make no sense, would fall apart if I said that the spirit is at some other point. It's absurd to think of any other point. It has to be at that point, and that's what makes us human. Yes, ma'am.
People and all being integrated and unity. And before you came out of the world, I sacrificed. I obeyed you to call her confidence. So that means that even before you are born, you are
Yeah.
the Lord of you. So it's definitely.
That's Jeremiah 51, right? 1:5, sorry. Yeah. Jan?
You confirm it, right? I know the piece of one in gospel where when Mary comes to visit Elizabeth, her father in the womb is speaking up because he knows that there is the Messiah has come.
Right.
He didn't even argue that he didn't be converted into be a follower of Jehovah. He didn't even
Right. There was a response for sure. Andrew,
those are theological,
of course.
and the other.
Yep.
Well, I'm looking for
The thing-
developing spiritually in heaven, that's good, because I know I'm imperfect here and I can't do all of the.
Okay, I'm just going to turn here for a second, look at some questions.
It's the only comment.
Okay. Right, even secular society is well aware the preborn are human. Remember Scott Peterson, who was convicted of a double homicide for killing his 8 months pregnant wife, Lacey. I remember that case. Yeah. Okay,
I have a question, Don, for you.
Yeah. question.
Do you know when was the Canadian Criminal Code changed to add that phrase for the definition of you? Was it as a result of the people being accepting abortion, or was it way before that?
I do not know. I do not know. I don't believe that that definition is a recent one. There's no particular reason to believe that. I think that when they formulated the criminal code, it probably was some time ago, but it's a good question. Yeah, I don't think it was, I do not think that the definition was created in order to get away with abortions up until the time of birth. That, to answer that question,
Yeah.
it was not deliberate, I don't believe, no. It's a classic case of unintended consequences. The unintended consequence of section 223 is that we can do whatever we want with unborn children. Jackie. Right.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
Really broadly, when it comes to, with all respect to our government, and the US, the Supreme Courts, why is it these arguments are so logically so clear to us that are, relatively simple code? You can learn that doctors or not, but relatively not ruling
Yeah.
ruling people without governance. What are the higher people in the land ruling? I guess just the way they do. Why is this?
Well, I really don't want to get into politics because it's a whole different subject, and I'm not ducking your question. The main reason I don't want to get into it is because it's a real quagmire of arguments, and it becomes fairly complex. The closest I wanted to get tonight was at highlighting what the criminal code says so that we all understand something that most people don't know. That's not a political statement, that's just a legal statement, right? But the short answer to your question is because, as a society, we're evil. We come up with evil things. And I personally believe that there's a war on the unborn. The preborn, there's an actual spiritual war. That's my own view. There's lots of hands going up. Let's go to the back. Okay.
Combine intelligent human beings, right? Politics, we're all with brains, intelligence, knowledge. Really, all this started in Genesis, and I didn't really have to that property. At least we're separated from God. For all you've seen in cultural categories, God, I believe this is in Romans. So all of us are actually genetically inherited the sin. So it's just a simple nature. And every day we practice the way that we have the businesses. But it falls to encompasses and tell the phrase, politics, or whoever, they have already made it.
No. Someone said that, someone said recently to me that they're shocked that, that to find out that governments, all governments around the world are made up of people. And they're selfish people just like us. So we have a bunch of selfish people trying to tell a whole bunch of other selfish people how they must live their lives. That's the fact of all countries that have governments, is that they are made of people. At the back.
Something that you can use it to grow perspective.
Unfortunately, we cannot hear the questions. We who are online, we can't hear the questions at all.
I'm going to repeat the question. So the question was, what's the most compelling pro-choice argument that I've heard? And how would I respond to it? Is that basically your question? Yeah. So I think that some of the ones we addressed tonight are probably the ones that I have heard from people that, let's just say, are more thoughtful on the subject. They're not just emotional. They don't just, I mean, I had a conversation once with an individual, he happened to be a woman, and her response when I just mentioned the fact that there's no law pertaining to abortions in Canada whatsoever. I just mentioned it as a fact, not as, I wasn't making any claims about it. For all she knew, I was pro-abortion too. And she just said, well, when you can pop out a baby, then you can have something to say about it. And I thought, okay, well, that's not an argument. That's just emotion, right? But I think that this issue of it's not a person is probably the most challenging one. We have to be able to separate people who say, yeah, it's not human. I think that was fairly easy, just based on science. Personhood is a more obscure term and a little bit harder to define. And it really does come back to the fact that just as all preborns become adults, all preborns become persons because they become adults, right? And it isn't 99.9% of the time. It's 100% of the time. When a mother and a father, have sex, create a growing baby, 100% of the time, it's a human baby. It's never anything else if you just let it grow. And so that same argument, I think, is the one I would fall back to say, you tell me when you become a person. Like, when did you become a person? Right? And most people won't be able to answer that question. But what I would say to them is, you've been a person your whole life. All you've been doing is developing as a person, right? In the same way that you've been human your whole life, both when you're in the womb and after. So that's the one. The other one tends to be that I've received, that I hear a lot, and that's challenging, is the argument based on suffering. Women that have been, raped, deformities, you name it, where there's been real physical or other challenge related to the pregnancy. And these are more difficult because they are extremely emotional, especially if you're talking to the person who's going through that or living through that, or who had a friend or a family member who went through it. Those are the more difficult ones. And this is where you need to have wisdom and you need to have a lot of grace, but you cannot suddenly change the premise of what you believe. Because if you do, then you're on a slippery slope as well. And they'll push you further and further away from the truth. We have to continue to hold the line when we say that we believe the preborn are human and therefore worthy of defense. Now, these other arguments that are put forward, we have to care for as a society. We have to deal with these questions in a compassionate way, without compromising, the truth. I'll say this about some of the political process that troubles me, and this is just my opinion, okay? This is not something that I want you to go out and build a church on. But our dear brothers and sisters to the south have a variety of different approaches to this when it comes to legislation. And some states, as you may know, have really gone the whole hog and said no abortions up for any reason of any kind, no matter what. And this has just been a real challenge for a lot of other states that say, well, wait a minute, should there not be some exceptions, in the case of this or in the case of that, right? And the problem that I see is not that the argument isn't sound. I think if abortion's wrong, it's wrong all the time, period, no matter what. But when you're trying to change a law, then you have to give some ground. It's a negotiation. And if you go for the whole enchilada, you may not get anything. And I think that some states are making the mistake of being completely intransigent on this point, and therefore are in danger of not getting any change to any law whatsoever, because people will just dig their heels in and they'll say, no, we're not going to change. And I think that's unwise. If I'm talking politics with a person and they bring up the argument, say, well, what about case of rape? My own personal response is fine. In the case of rape, the woman can have an abortion. Why would I do that? Well, because I'm trying to change the 99% of abortions that are birth control related, not rape related. There's a very, very small percentage of women that get pregnant as a result of rape. So if in taking a wise, non-confrontational approach, I just take that off the table, what have I left the other person with? Nothing. They now have no argument because I've conceded what they wanted. Now, I'm just talking about political process, legal arguments, how are we going to gain back the ground that has been lost? That's what I'm talking about. And I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's morally the best answer. I'm just saying that if we continue to say, I'm not going to move on any point, we could, as a group, lose everything. And we don't want that to happen, right? We're trying to move things along. So there are wiser people than me, of course, on this, but it is amazing when a person raises this and you say, back to them and say, fine, okay, in that case, yeah, it should be legally allowed. Because that isn't the point. That's not what we would all love to change. What we'd all love to change is that this is a horrific practice that is used for birth control. And if you want more data on that, you can talk to Jackie later. She lives and breathes this stuff. So
Can I just put your argument around this to ask you a question? Do we as God's people and do we as government, do we not have a responsibility to care for those that are newborn, unborn, disabled? Listen, one person didn't say that we know that the nature of the country, by the way, that we treat our most vulnerable.
yes,
So is this not the case?
it is.
So then, I'm asking this to the question here. Do we actually have, typically, we as God's people have the responsibility to take care of the preborn and unborn that are, and even if we did, if we just opened up, like, even, I think some arguments say that if we open up our homes, some believers were somewhat saying that we don't have children,
Mhm.
not even have children. Then we would, that's what we take care of.
Well, this is what I meant. This is what I meant earlier when I said that we need to be pro-life 24/7. It means that we need to be willing to make sacrifices to support women who want to carry their pregnancies. A lot of people say, well, I'm pro-life. And then they meet somebody who's really struggling with, wanting to carry their baby to term. And when they say, well, will you help me? They run a mile. Well, that's not being pro-life 24/7. So Jackie's the person to talk to. This is what she does. She organizes people to support people and walk them through unplanned pregnancies because it's a crisis. Absolutely. Jackie, go ahead. Please.
That question I asked my conservative MP to pro-life, why didn't he take it for? And his answer to her was, I don't have enough support in my MPs that are in the individual constituency wanted to get reelected, and you were insistent, they stepped up to be pro-life, they wouldn't get reelected. So how come when you take it, you have to ask them of the party?
Yeah, it's the same what's happening
Right,
now.
so,
We don't want to
yeah.
get into politics.
Yeah.
I don't want to, one of the leaders, he's pro-life, but he knows he's not going to get elected, but so he's willing to do incrementally. And he's willing to go full freedom on a lot of issues. And then when there's enough critical mass, if he feels he can do the abortion thing, he will. But you start off, like you said, you start off with that, you're not.
You're not gonna get anywhere.
You won't get it.
Mm.
And
So I just want to bring us back to some questions, and
I got a question for you.
hang on a sec. You got one online?
I don't know if there's a question or comment.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so, if I can just kind of conclude this whole discussion and say this, that we need to recognize that as soon as we get into these types of issues, we're getting into complex things. And I really didn't want to go there tonight, and I'm not going to let us go there. My purpose was to try and stick to the science. What does science tell us? And I believe that this is just, in case you missed that point, it's really the major point of what I'm trying to present. And that is that 50 years ago, we did not know what we know about growing preborn children. We now have amazing technology. We are doing surgeries in the womb today that were unheard of even 5 years ago, using technology that is just mind-boggling. I watched a documentary series on about a doctor who specializes his whole life. It's all he's ever done is do intrauterine surgery, and has cured and fixed a number of issues in utero that beforehand the baby would have died for sure. And if you were to ask this guy, are you pro-life? I mean, there's no question. His whole life was devoted to it. And I thought to myself, here's a man who has devoted his life to being pro-life in a practical way and has skills that very few people in the world have. C. Everett Koop, you may have heard his name, about 30 years ago was the Surgeon General of the United States. And he co-authored a book with Francis Schaeffer at the time called Whatever Happened to the Human Race. And C. Everett Koop was a pediatric surgeon that focused on intrauterine technologies. He was one of the pioneers. But if he were alive today, he would not believe the stuff that we can do. And so we live in this incongruous world where science, which everybody says they want to follow, tells us something that we're all ignoring. And that's really the purpose of the approach that I've tried to take. And that is just show them the science. And a lot of people will go, wow.
If a woman who's involved in this, you're asking her if she's pregnant and her child is at risk of going to birth, the hospital is going to try to save both the embryo in the womb and her, aren't they? Aren't they obligated by the protocol to do that?
Most,
They don't just let the baby die.
no, most hospitals would try, but the mother's life would definitely take priority. Yeah. Yeah.
But they don't just say, well, forget about the embryo.
No, they'll do what they can, but if they don't save the mother, they don't, then they lose both lives.
It's considered a life for them. You
Sure.
can't say both lives, you can't, of course, the mother is fine.
Sure. Andrew.
This is reasonable to have it with on control. The reasonable to say, I don't know, the baby is not your body, but your body is on your own. That's reasonable to say that.
What do you mean by on loan? You mean when you die?
Saying my body, my choice.
Right,
And you're saying that not only is the baby, but not the body, is that, even her own body is given to her, and it was, it's not really, so this is her body, it's a gift, well, this is the Christian perspective.
yeah.
Gift from God.
Do I think that that would fly?
No.
The short answer, no, I don't think so, Andrew. Because of the autonomy of the person in our society has been elevated to, unfortunately, very high heights, where that's where this whole argument, comes from. My body, my choice. It's the assertion of my individuality, and you can't touch that. That's the premise, right? But as a society, this is a different topic, of course, but it's related. We have never been successful as a society in history when the individual has been able to assert their autonomy over society. That's never been successful. It will always fail. And sadly, that's where we are right now. We have to get back to the concept of community, and that we are a part of a community, and that yes, you're an individual in that community, but the community has a role to play as well. And I think that's what's missing in much of the West. Well, look at the French Revolution. The French Revolution was predicated on rising up, and you're not going to tell us what to do. And that really ended well, didn't it? The list goes on, right? Yes, Jan.
It looks like, the subject really revolves around the definition of the human when the life of the human starts. And I think once this is really properly established, then all the other things fall in place. If you have your body with sleep, then the child has to have a choice too. And here, mother doesn't want to be in choice, then we should have somebody else, some vicarious entity who will give the choice. And who will argue from the legal perspective, because then legal becomes obvious as well, right?
Well, this exactly illustrates. This exactly illustrates my point, Jan, that I just made, and that is that if the individual has all of the power and community has no power, then you're going to end up where we are. But if community says, well, wait a minute, if you don't want that baby, we will deal with that. We will take that and lift that off of you so that, yeah, you don't have to take, extreme measures. That's the difference, right? And I think that if we can make this claim, and this is what many people are trying to do, is to bring community to the concept, where the community will embrace the mother, help her through it so that she doesn't have to make that choice, is awesome. And that's what we need to do. Yes, ma'am.
Oftentimes, men don't see, I just want to go on one reason, because men feel
Yes.
so we are going to win this war of avoiding abortion. Men also have to be doing discussion.
Yeah.
They really are successful as human beings. Even though they're all the ones that want to go to abortion, they always change.
Yeah. Yeah.
So always try to get to the situation as well. The man has been given the so the man has this things to go.
Yeah.
And that's one thing that I say, like saying,
Right. So I'm just going to repeat that for the people online, because they probably didn't hear your comment. But basically, the point that's being made is that, this issue is not just a woman's issue, but it's a men's issue as well. Unfortunately, men have, to a large degree, and especially in some societies, have abdicated their responsibility for fatherhood, and they've just, said, well, that's your problem. And the caricature of the freewheeling stud who wants to go around and just sleep with all the women he wants, but whatever whenever they get pregnant, he just runs and there's no consequences for him is not good. And so you're 100% correct. I think that, you know, I lived for many years in Africa, and I can tell you that it is a real problem from a societal cultural perspective, where there's a lot of abandonment. But the same is true in the United States, where we know statistically the number of kids growing up who are fatherless is much higher than kids growing up who are motherless. It's always the fatherless statistic that catches our eye, and it's true. I think that the corollary problem with this is that a lot of women who are pro-abortion don't want men to get involved because they see that as, you know, the other side recruiting troops that they shouldn't be allowed to do. So that's something we have to overcome. But your point's absolutely well taken. Thank you. Anything else online? Okay. Any other? I'm going to take one more question and then we're going to adjourn for the night. Yes, ma'am.
So my, I think with this problem with all solution and with all of this participation and things tonight, I think we can, you know, actually match the resources because from what I have read, I don't even know there are so many include the couple, and they have to wait for years to get an adoption of baby. They are so dying to have a baby. So there's a problem, but it's a piece of family. We just have to match the resource, and there, you know, the problem may go away. So what the only thing that I see is that when like a moral issue arises, okay, or a financial issue, that can be adopted. The moral issue that you have mentioned earlier. If that child is conceived by, let's say, rape or incest or whatever, a bad reason, or maybe it's not a healthy thing. So maybe that is another issue to discuss, but not after we don't discuss that. We actually want to discuss it's a huge magnificent problem. So I think it's next to resource.
Yep.
Maybe that can help about.
I agree. And I think, you know, again, when we approach these more thorny, let's call them more thorny or more complex issues, let's start by defining our terms, and let's start by establishing that the preborn is a human being and a person entitled to life. And now let's talk about what we're going to do about the problem. If we don't do that, then we have no grounds. And that's all I'm really saying here. If we can start from that perspective in a conversation with someone or a group, then we're at least establishing what we believe the truth is. Now, society has to make difficult choices, even in the face of things that are true. That's just a fact of, you know, being a society. And I'm not here to say how that can be done or what should be done in these more thorny, complex issues. I'm just saying, let's at least be clear about what the preborn is, so that we can't use throwaway terms like it's just a product of conception, or it's just a mass of tissue, or it's whatever, fill in the blank. No, it's none of those things. It is a human being. So if we can start there, at least we have some ground from which we can then proceed with a more complex discussion. That's really the point. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for journeying from wherever you came from. Thank you everyone online for participating with us, and really appreciate it. All right. We'll be back here again the first Monday of each month we meet.
Second
Here. Sorry.
for the Labor Day.
It'll be the second Monday next month. That's right. Yeah, it's always going to be in this room. From now on, yes. Oh, no, it's always different. Always different. And we'll